As we have talked about this restoration movement, basically what we have kind of seen is we've seen a movement that began in the early 1800s, and as this movement went forward, we see this stream of thought that develops, one of the fastest growing religious movements in America, that ultimately is going to have something of a division that takes place. And as this division occurs, around 1906, we see two groups that come out of this restoration movement. The one group is the disciples of Christ. The other group will be the churches of Christ, and this is specifically the non-instrumental, the a cappella churches of Christ. So this will be in 1906. As liberalism impacts and as the mission issues become bigger and more problematic, we're going to see an additional development that takes place within the disciples of Christ. We're going to see another movement. As the disciples of Christ go forward, this further division, beginning in 1927, will leave us with a group called the Christian churches and churches of Christ. And then we have got the disciples of Christ continuing forward. And so we end up with three groups: the disciples of Christ, that are the more liberal group, the Christian churches and churches of Christ, which have sometimes been described as something of an evangelical type of group, and then the churches of Christ a cappella, which initially I would say were probably more like a fundamentalist type of group, but have become a little bit less extreme in some of their positions. They've opened up a little bit more. So we see these movements developing. And as you remember, as we talked about this, we talked about three pivotal areas of thought. We talked about unity, we talked about restoration or truth, and we talked about reaching the world for Christ. For the more liberal group, the disciples, the idea of unity becomes pivotal. This is their main idea. And for the churches of Christ, at least for a long time, their focus was on the idea of restoration, of getting back to the biblical ideas. And the biblical ideas became something more about what we believe to be the biblical ideas, what we believe are the ideas that should be adhered to. And you had factions, even among the churches of Christ. You had some said you could only use one communion cup. You had some that said you could use a songbook, but it can't have musical instrument or musical notes in it. And so you had a number of divisions. You can have a hired minister, you can't have a hired minister. A lot of division took place. Now, among these people, among all of these groups, there are some very good and legitimate and genuine people. And I don't mean to in any way to be tearing apart the entire group of people. But in some ways, these groups developed in this way with the Christian Church of Christ sort of focusing a little bit more on the idea of mission, upon reaching the world for Christ. And that became some of their main ideas. I mean, they separated because of the missions issue and because of liberalism creeping into the missions. And so the idea of reaching the world to Christ through unity and through truth is one of the primary ideas of this restoration movement. Now today, as we look at the various churches, the groups that have developed, the Christian Church Disciples of Christ, this is the name of the denomination, the more liberal fellowship, the Christian Church, and in parentheses usually it says Disciples of Christ. This group, again, this was a group that for many years they functioned with what became the Christian Church of Christ as more conservative element within the Disciples of Christ. But in 1968, the Disciples of Christ went through this whole process that became known as Restructure. And the whole Restructure program was sort of an effort to put the disciples back into being a denomination. In fact, they established a general minister and president of the denomination. They have a central headquarters for the denomination. They established an official logo for the denomination. So it has become kind of the early Restoration Movement idea of the disciples and the Christians and all this, they kind of were withdrawing from denominationalism, saying we don't want to have this denominational structure. When people in the Restoration Movement generally say we're not denomination, we're non-denominational, I've had people talk to me and say, well, you're just as much a denomination as anybody. You denominate yourself. But the idea is that we do not set ourselves up with a denominational framework. There's no bishop, there's no archbishop or some controlling figure. Each church is locally autonomous and controls itself. And that was a pivotal part of this Restoration Movement from its beginning. But the disciples have sort of turned that around, and they have established a structure that controls the denomination. As a result of this, their headquarters is in Indianapolis, Indiana, and they have become more and more liberal. They've become more concerned about social issues and things of this nature. And again, I'm not talking about the regular everyday person in the pews of a disciple church, but generally the leadership of the disciples. They've simply become more liberal in many ways, and as a result, what has happened is their numbers have declined dramatically. They have had incredible decline in their numbers. In fact, I recently saw that since 2007, from between 2007 and 2017, that 10-year period, they have declined in membership by 35%. So, it's been a drastic, over 1/3 that have left the disciples' denomination. They have seen dramatic decline. They are very liberal in many of their ideas. Many of their thought is from a very liberal perspective. One of the guys in charge of this whole process that became Restructure of the disciples back in 1968, one of the guys who's going to kind of set up this new denomination is a guy named Dale Fires. And Dale Fires himself, very liberal, and in fact, I have some quotes from some things that Fires wrote, and he wrote with some questions and answers. And so he was asked, "Do you believe in a personal devil?" He said, "No, do not." When asked about evil in the world, he said, "Well, it's just a reality. Evil is just there." He says, "I accept the reality of evil in all of its manifestations, moral, mental, and physical, not as the work of some perverted cosmic being, but as incidental to the kind of world we live in." So it's just there. That's all he would say. Other questions asked to him: "Do you believe in the virgin birth of Christ?" He said, quote, "I do not consider it of vital importance to believe in Jesus as the Christ, and moreover, I feel it must not be made an issue, but left entirely to one's opinion and judgment." So he says, we don't have to worry about this type of idea. "Do you believe in the resurrection of Jesus as a suspension of natural law?" "I do not accept the commonly held view of the physical resurrection of Jesus, but I cannot escape the conviction that there was objective validity in the resurrection of Jesus and in the experiences of his disciples who were reported to have seen him after his death. I do not think it necessary to regard this as wholly outside the realm of natural process." So he doesn't even really accept that idea of the resurrection of Christ. In other questions, he was asked, do you think baptism is necessary to the salvation of the individual? He said, "No, I think that view of baptism would involve something of a magical efficacy in the external rite, which is not true to the mind of Christ or compatible with truth." So he didn't even accept that idea. So they became more and more liberal, and as a result, their numbers have dramatically declined. Now, for the churches of Christ, following their 1906 separation from the disciples, you've got to see that when they separated, they had nothing to do with the disciples. And so when this Church of Christ Christian Church development to this separation occurred, really the churches of Christ never quite caught on to that until some time later. They didn't really see what was taking place there in any large, significant way. But following their separation from the disciples of Christ, the churches of Christ became something of a fundamentalist type of group, kind of turned inward and focused inward more than anything else. You had two primary groups that developed as the a cappella churches. You had the non-instrumental churches. They simply opposed instrumental music within the church, but they often didn't see it as such a huge matter of salvation, and they didn't accept it. They didn't like it, but it's just one of those things that it's an error like many others. But then there are some, the anti-instrumental, the non-institutional, who took this to a very extreme idea. This is an issue of salvation. If you use a musical instrument, a piano or whatever musical instrument, it's an issue of your salvation. You're lost. So they actually grew dramatically. They grew dramatically after their separation from the disciples of Christ. They started off as a relatively small group, but they have grown rather dramatically. Today there are some significant universities and institutions affiliated with the Churches of Christ, schools like Pepperdine University, Lipscomb University. And so you have some really dynamic growth within them over the years. They have since kind of left this idea of this fundamentalist inward turned idea, and they become more of an evangelical type of group. The group that became the Christian churches and churches of Christ, or sometimes it's just simply known as the independent churches, they began this separation in 1927. But there'll be a series of events, and like I said previously, the real listing as a separate group occurred in 1971. But through the time, there's going to be a series of things that they continually seem to build a bigger chasm of separation from the disciples. But they were always considered a part of the disciples of Christ until 1971. After that, they are listed as a separate group. This is the group that's affiliated or has traditionally been affiliated with the North American Christian Convention. They have displayed, perhaps in the earliest days, a strong fundamentalist point of view, very inward focused, but they have generally now been more of an evangelical group. You're going to have people like James DeForest Murch, who actually was a leading figure in the evangelical, the National Association of Evangelicals. He's going to be one of the founding leaders of the Christianity Today magazine, and he's going to be a very prominent, very important figure for these Christian churches of Christ, and actually led the way when it came to this issue of should we remain a part of the disciples as they develop themselves into a denomination. And the Christian churches of Christ have held to a very strong, very rigid, independent nature to their churches. Their churches have had a very strong sense of local autonomy. Each church controls itself. Board of elders and leadership being within the churches. This group has also been very, very missions oriented. The Christian churches of Christ, have had a strong, strong emphasis on missions over the years. They have seen some dramatic growth over the years, and in fact, since 1927, the growth has been rather remarkable. Several colleges and universities have been developed, a number of other things, many mega churches. We have been affiliated with a lot of the larger mega churches. And so this has been a group that has grown over the years and has really prospered since separating from the disciples. Now, the thing about this restoration movement, there's a brilliant history of this. I mean, there's a lot that goes in to our history as churches. And As we've gone through these videos, we've talked about some of the history, and in fact, it's been kind of an overview of the history. There's a lot more to look at, and there's been some wonderful books and some other things that have been written about this, and I just want to encourage all of you who may be interested, take a look at your history. History is an anchor. It ties us to who we are and to who we're going to be. It reminds us what we think and why we think these ways. You know, we're not just a group of churches that says we're Christian churches and churches of Christ just because that just sort of happened that way. There's reasons for this. I encourage you strongly, look more deeply into our restoration heritage. Look into this story of who we are and some of the things that have transpired and emerged from our heritage as Restoration Movement churches. I hope through our videos you've been able to gain some insight into the development of our fellowship of churches and to see who we are, to develop some of our theological ideas and concepts. But don't stop here. Continue moving forward as you look at who we are as Christian churches and churches of Christ. I hope these videos are important and meaningful to you. It's been a pleasure to bring them to you.